Clemson and Notre Dame rematch in the most important ACC Championship game in history. The College Football Playoff Committee keeps Florida in the top 10 to help Alabama. And Virginia Tech ends the nation's longest bowl streak. I'm Jay Smith, and this is After Further Review.
And now, after further review, a Clemson student's perspective on sports.
And a personal foul on number 99 of the defense after he tackled the quarterback. He's giving them business down there. That's a 15-yard penalty.
Well, welcome in, everyone. I'm Jay Smith, and yes, this is After Further Review. Thanks so much for tuning in, whether you're listening to AFR, it's the podcast available on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you listen to your podcast, or hey, if you're watching on Facebook. And a little bit of a bonus if you're watching on Facebook, because this episode is the ugly Christmas sweater edition of AFR. Yes, I got my ugly Christmas sweater on. It's Baby Yoda from The Mandalorian. Pretty quality sweater for those of you that can see it. It's certainly very warm. But hey, yeah, like I said, it's Christmas time, so figured we'd throw in an ugly Christmas sweater episode. But let's transition now and talk about this ACC Championship game between Clemson and Notre Dame that, by all accounts, by all metrics, is the most important ACC Championship game in the league's history, right? This is number 2 Notre Dame in their first ever ACC Championship, taking on number 3 Clemson, and you gotta think that this feels like almost a quarterfinal game for the college football playoff. Now, as we've gone through all the different scenarios, Notre Dame can lose this game, and I think there may still be a path for them since they're currently sitting undefeated. But for Clemson, right at 9-1, already with a loss to Notre Dame earlier this season, certainly if they were to lose a second game, there's a very slim chance that they would even be able to make the playoff. Now, because Florida lost this past weekend to LSU, which we will get to in a second, or I guess I should call them LSU, as I've seen the joke going around. But either way, right now, the Florida loss to LSU kind of opened the door for a lot of craziness to happen, because now, Alabama's going to be going up against a 2-loss team in the SEC Championship, and Florida has eliminated themselves. I don't even see a situation where, Florida beats Alabama and makes it into the playoff. Now, I think the committee keeping Florida in the top 10 is a deliberate move to make Alabama's resume look better. And I don't, say what you want about Florida, but I don't think they deserve to be in the top 10 after that loss to LSU. And I really, I picked Florida out of the East this year. That was the team that I picked out of the East. I didn't pick them to win the SEC, but I'm not convinced that the Gators are a top 10 team, and I'm not at all convinced that they're going to compete with Alabama. Now, leaving them at 7 certainly makes you think that, the committee's trying to leave the door open for them, maybe. But a 2-loss Florida team with their only real signature win being over Alabama, it just it would leave a bad taste in my mouth. But that's not what we're talking about right now. We're talking about Clemson, and we're talking about Notre Dame in an ACC championship that is a rematch. And this is really something that you don't see in the ACC at all, because for the last several years, the Atlantic Division has really dominated, right? It was between Clemson and Florida State for who would, more than likely win the conference. I think that's been the case dating back for the past several years. Now, Florida State's obviously fallen off, and Clemson's on a historic run right now. They've won 5 straight ACC championships. They're going to appear in their 6th straight, which ties the FBS record for most all time with 2 other schools. And if they were to win this game against Notre Dame, it's my understanding that they would be the first school to win 6 straight conference championships, I believe, at least in the Power 5. But either way, this is a huge game, because it not only matters for, the ACC and the record books and all that, but this has a huge impact on the college football playoff and what that looks like. you know, Clemson being on the run that they are on right now with, seeking that sixth straight conference title, seeking, I think what would be, their sixth straight college football playoff appearance. And this is actually, I found this article on Clemson Sports Talk, and it went through all of the teams that have been in the college football playoff rankings since the inception of the CFP, all the way back in was it 2015, I think. 20 let's see, is it 2015? It was 2014. It was 2014. Yes, that was 2014. Which was actually the year that Mississippi State and Ole Miss were in the top four briefly, and Ohio State ended up winning that year because they were the first national champion in the CFP era. But if you look at the rankings, if you look at the rankings for Clemson in the CFP era, it's really impressive. Total weeks ranked, Clemson right now is first with 33 weeks ranked in the top four. Alabama is currently second at 32. Now, the real disparity there is obviously Clemson has spent only 8 weeks at number one. Alabama has spent 22. Clemson's kind of spread it out over the top four spots. 8 weeks at number one, 10 weeks at number two, 11 weeks at third, and then 4 weeks at fourth. Notre Dame actually is fourth on this list of teams. You have Clemson at 1, Alabama's 2, Ohio State is third, and Notre Dame is fourth. And there are only 4 teams in college football that have spent double-digit number of weeks ranked in the top 4. And Clemson and Notre Dame are 2 of those schools. Notre Dame has 14 weeks ranked in the top 4, 3 at fourth, 7 at third, and then 4 at second. So all this is to say, right, this is a huge matchup. And normally, Notre Dame's not in the ACC, right? If they're an independent, and they play a heavy ACC schedule, but they're not officially an ACC team. And, a lot of people earlier this year kind of criticized John Swofford's decision, the ACC commissioner, John Swofford, his decision to sort of throw Notre Dame a lifeline and give them a schedule, because at the time, right, most independents, with the cancellations, they just weren't really playing many games at all. I think it was the right move, though. And it's certainly shaped up to be the case, because this inclusion of Notre Dame in the regular ACC, standings and all that, right? This has created the most intrigue for an ACC title game ever. The game has never been more important, because there's 2 teams right now in the ACC that are in the top 3. They already played each other once this season, and the arguable premier ACC team in Clemson, right, the team that's been in the ACC and that's been really, really good for the longest, lost that game. And so now you have a rematch where, it's like two prize fighters, they felt each other out. And I'm not going to say that this will be a Clemson-Alabama style rivalry where the teams go back and forth for multiple years. But, I remember when Clemson and Notre Dame played in 2015. I was at that game. It was phenomenal, and it was really close. It was 24-22. It was a last second 2-point conversion stop by Clemson to win that game. And when they played up in South Bend earlier this year, it was an instant classic. So both games, both of the last 2 matchups have been great. I think that this ACC Championship game will also be very, very close. Right now, Clemson is favored by 10 points. And, I think that, as the season has progressed, obviously things have changed. Clemson's not as sharp as they were at the beginning of the year. But you got to think that if this game, being on the road in South Bend without Trevor Lawrence, without 3 starters on defense, I think with Clemson having 3 turnovers, Etienne had that fumble. There were a lot of errors, and Notre Dame still needed 2 overtimes at home to beat them. So in a neutral site location, if Clemson's healthy and they got all their guys, you should favor Clemson, right? This is not a surprise that Clemson's favored by 10. Another thing you have to consider is that in the last 3 ACC championships, Clemson's played Miami, Pitt, and Virginia, and they've beaten them by a combined score of 142-30. So the last three ACC championships really haven't been close. I'm thinking back to like the 2015 game between Clemson and UNC. That one was fairly tight, but I don't think this ACC championship game is going to be a walk in the park like we've seen for Clemson the last 3 years. Tigers are going to have to earn this win. Notre Dame is, right now in the driver's seat. They're 10-0. They're obviously they're undefeated. They beat the number one team in the country in Clemson earlier this season. They have a senior quarterback in Ian Book, and Notre Dame has their eyes set on the playoff, and they understood almost as soon as the Clemson game finished during the regular season, hey, we're going to have to play these guys again. We're going to have to play these guys again in an ACC championship if we want to get into the playoff. So they know what's at stake. And then if you're Clemson, as I've kind of touched on, right, they started out really, really hot, consensus number one team in the country, thrashing everyone they played, and then they definitely slowed down in the middle part of the season. There were some games that they just played sloppy. There were some games where, it just didn't feel like things were quite as things were just clicking like they had been earlier in the year. And one of the I think the causes of that is not necessarily just the play calling, which I think Clemson's play calling right now is one of the biggest. It's what's holding them back, I feel like. I think Trevor Lawrence has been very consistent. When he's been able to play, but play calling has been an issue for Clemson, and Travis Etienne has not been quite as dynamic as I think a lot of people expected him to be. And if Clemson wants to win this game on Saturday, they're going to need Travis Etienne to show up. And he needs to be efficient, right? He doesn't need to have 200 yards on the ground. But Etienne has not had a 100-yard rushing game since October 10th. So it's been 2 months since Etienne got 100 yards on the ground. And that, again, for a star running back, when you're not able to move the ball efficiently on the ground, you're going to become one-dimensional, and it causes problems. And we've seen that with Clemson. We've seen that with their games the last couple of months. And against Notre Dame, right, Etienne had 28 yards on the ground, and he averaged 1.56 yards per carry. That was a career low for Travis Etienne. And again, he made a lot of mental mistakes that game. You could certainly tell. I don't chalk it up as not having Trevor Lawrence. I just think Clemson was not mentally sharp for that game. I don't think, because they knew a week and a half in advance that Trevor Lawrence was not going to be playing that game, right? So they had time to kind of mentally prepare, and they just didn't show up at all, sharp. They played well, and obviously the game was competitive. It wasn't a blowout, but Etienne having, 1.5 yards per carry and 28 yards rushing, career lows, that's not showing up sharp and ready to play. And, even in the passing game, Etienne's really been neutralized, and that has affected Clemson a lot because, Etienne is part of what makes Clemson's offense so potent, and it's not just Trevor Lawrence, it's not just the great receivers, but Etienne was such a dynamic playmaker. If they don't incorporate Etienne into the game plan and he doesn't perform like we know he can perform on Saturday, the Tigers could be playing from behind for most of the game. And, on the other side, right, we talked about the offense now. Let's talk about the defense. Okay, if you're Clemson, you've got to stop the run. You've got to stop the run. Tyler Davis, James Skalski are the difference makers there. But Notre Dame in that first matchup against Clemson, they did something that most Clemson fans aren't used to seeing, which is run the ball pretty well against what's typically a stout Clemson defense. And actually, the Irish in that game, they were the first team since Alabama in 2016, okay, so 4 years ago, to rush for over 200 yards against a Brent Venables defense. It had been until that game earlier this season, it had been 4 years since Clemson had allowed 200 yards on the ground. And I think for even the Tiger defense, you could tell there was a lot of just kind of shell shock because they were like, my gosh, these guys are running all over us. And Ian Book was throwing the ball pretty well. And Notre Dame played a great game. They played a clean game. They didn't make a lot of mistakes. It was sloppy at times for Clemson. And, you can't do that when you're playing a college football playoff caliber opponent. And that's what Notre Dame is this year. In the years past where people have made fun of them and said, oh, these guys, they can't compete. And obviously that was proven right when Clemson played them in the Cotton Bowl, and it was a blowout. Notre Dame this year can compete in the college football playoff. They're definitely one of the best 4 teams in the country. And if Clemson can't run the ball with Etienne and make him dynamic and a big playmaker and part of this game, and they can't stop the run on defense, the Tigers are going to be in trouble. They're going to be in trouble, and they're likely going to be playing from behind. And Brent Venables, right, one of the best defensive minds in the game, he has a second chance now at Ian Book. He has an opportunity to review game film. He's going to have the ability to look at what happened, hindsight, and kind of evaluate and tweak the game plan. But at the end of the day, the defense has to execute. You have to get pressure. You have to make Ian Book uncomfortable. You have to stop the run. And again, it's going to come down to executing the little things that Clemson didn't do in the game prior during the regular season. One thing on offense, though, that I think stuck out to me, besides Etienne, is just the red zone efficiency for Clemson. They settled for 2 field goals inside the 20-yard line during the first meeting, right? Clemson was down in the red zone twice and kicked field goals. And that might work against Pitt. It might work against Virginia. It might work against, whoever you're playing, but it's not going to work against Notre Dame. So Clemson has to take away, they have to get touchdowns. When they're in the red zone, you need to score touchdowns. And Notre Dame has a really stingy defense in the red zone. That's going to be the matchup to watch offensively if you're a Clemson fan. How does Clemson perform in the red zone against a really good Notre Dame defense? Not just because it will affect the outcome of this game, but because the teams they're going to face in the college football playoff, right, the Ohio States, the Alabamas, they're going to have stingy defenses, especially in the red zone. So Clemson needs to figure out how to convert touchdowns when they're in the red zone as opposed to kicking field goals. I think obviously they're going to incorporate Trevor Lawrence with that read option in the red zone, something they didn't have. That was not a weapon that they had during the first game. And Clemson will get creative with their play calling, but it's certainly something that you want to watch if you're a Clemson fan and you're paying attention to what's happening on offense. What are the guys able to do in the red zone? And I think if you're Notre Dame, the biggest thing for you is you recognize this is a different Clemson team. That you have to have the right mindset. You have to understand that this is not the same Clemson team that you faced earlier this season. They got a quarterback that's back. They got defensive starters that are back. They've had an opportunity to review game film on you. They just played you a few months ago. They're healthy. Totally different animal that Notre Dame's going to have to tackle this weekend. However, their game plan at large during the first matchup, it worked. It worked pretty well. Move the ball efficiently on the ground, protect Ian Book and give him time to throw the ball, and don't make mistakes. Don't make mental errors. And it's something that we saw Clemson do, right? Clemson made a lot of mental errors. Notre Dame really didn't. And so I think, if you're a Notre Dame fan and you're looking at this matchup, if it's not broke, don't fix it kind of mentality. But at the same time, you have to recognize, okay, this is going to be a different football team than we faced earlier this season. I think, overall, though, the biggest things are obviously Clemson has had multiple games this season where offense has been kind of just running in place and the defense has had to bail them out, right? We've seen defensive touchdowns a lot for Clemson this season. And so, if I guess that's a good thing to fall back on if you're Clemson, right? Because if your offense isn't being productive, if you go 10 to 15 minutes, if you go a quarter without scoring or without putting together a sustained drive, you might need the defense to step up and kind of bail you out of that funk. Now, I don't think that's really going to be a recipe for success in the college football playoff. We saw it work last year against Ohio State where Clemson had to kind of pull themselves out of a hole. But if you want to compete for a national championship, you have got to be playing to the level that you can play for pretty much 60 minutes. And you gotta be able to limit the mental errors. But again, I think the matchup for this one comes down to, what can Clemson do with Etienne? How dynamic can they make him? Is Notre Dame going to be able to run the ball against Clemson's defense? And, what's Clemson going to be able to do in the red zone? Are they going to settle for field goals, or are they going to score touchdowns? Obviously, these two teams have been on a collision course for a rematch pretty much since the first game concluded. I think Notre Dame, more than Clemson, has been looking ahead. You look at how Notre Dame played against UNC. You look at how they played against Syracuse, even Boston College. Those three games, which were the games they played between the Clemson game and then now, they weren't really very sharp. And I think that's because they were more focused on rematch with Clemson, rematch with Clemson, rematch with Clemson. And then if you look at Clemson, obviously, the Pitt game, dominant performance. Virginia Tech game, dominant performance. They were really sharp in those two games. But Clemson's only played two games since they matched up against Notre Dame on November 7th, and Notre Dame has only played 3 games since they matched up with Clemson. Clemson was 1 game at home, 1 game on the road. Notre Dame was 1 game at home, 2 games on the road. Just, something to keep in mind, because in a season where everybody's playing a different number of games, it does matter, where you're playing the games, how many games you're playing. Now, both of these teams have played 10 games. Even though they were originally scheduled for 11, but I think this is probably the most even even conference championship matchup across college football this season. SEC, it's not going to be competitive. The Big Ten, it's not going to be competitive. And I think even the Big 12 and the Pac-12. It's pretty lopsided in those conferences this year. So this has been a really good year for the ACC. The ACC has certainly got an argument for being the deepest conference right now, between Clemson and Notre Dame and Miami and UNC. I think there's a lot going on in the ACC that's really, really good. Coming down to who you're going to pick in this game, if you look right now, so according to the Capital One fan vote, in the rematch, this is the national vote right now in the Capital One fan vote. 65% are picking Clemson and 35% are picking Notre Dame. So that's a pretty heavy favor for Clemson, and I think it's justified. I really do. I don't think people are discounting Notre Dame. I think it's just a realization that the first matchup, Clemson didn't have their quarterback. They didn't have 3 stars on defense. It was an away game. It was double overtime. That really was a toss-up game. Could have gone either way. And, this is a neutral site location, and Clemson's going to have all their weapons back. So the odds are is that Clemson will win this game. Right now they're favored by 10. I could see him winning by 10 or 14. I don't think it stretches any further than that. I don't see him winning by 3 scores. But I think, this should be a good matchup. I think it's going to come down to those 3 things I mentioned earlier. And I think Clemson will ultimately prevail, and they'll win their 6th ACC title game. Should be an amazing matchup, though. It's certainly the game of the weekend, probably the game of the year. I mean, earlier this season, Notre Dame Clemson regular season was definitely the best game of the regular season in terms of college football playoff implications. I mean, there were certainly a lot of other good games this season. I'm thinking BYU and Coastal. There were a lot of other games on the slate that were exciting to watch, but regular season matchups, the game with the most college football playoff implications, Notre Dame and Clemson, bar none. Nothing else came close, and that's going to be the same case for their rematch, a historic rematch. I don't know when the last time, if it's ever happened, that the ACC has had a championship game where both teams were ranked in the top 3. The only time that I could think that would ever have happened would be like early 2000s, late 90s, maybe like a Florida State, Miami, maybe. I don't know. I don't know if that's ever happened, but yeah, this is certainly the biggest conference title game in the league's history. Should be a phenomenal game, but I ultimately think that Clemson is going to prevail in this one. Okay, let's take a break. We're going to come back, and we're going to talk about College Football Playoff Committee, their decision to keep Florida in the top 10. What does that mean for their credibility? What does it mean for the ACC Championship game? That discussion is next. Welcome back to the show, and thanks so much for tuning in. I'm Jay Smith, and you are listening to After Further Review. Let's talk about the SEC Championship game now. Right? Let's talk about the College Football Playoff rankings. New rankings came out, and Florida dropped one spot. They dropped one spot after their loss to LSU. I'm going to start calling them LSU. Gators sit now at 8-2, and they're going to be taking on the undefeated number 1 Crimson Tide this weekend. Now, you know, I understand that things happen in college football and teams lose games they really have no business losing, right? Florida had no business losing to LSU. No business. LSU was a team that had beaten, who had they beaten? They had beaten, I think, Arkansas, Missouri? No, I think it was Arkansas, South Carolina, and Vanderbilt. I think that's who LSU had beaten up to this point, right? They beat nobody. Cellar dwellers in the SEC. I mean, awful teams. And they beat Florida in a great game. I watched that game. Unbelievable game. I mean, it was obviously something that Florida kind of threw away, literally, with the throwing of the shoe. I mean, that really, I think, tops the piss and miss for Ole Miss last year in the Egg Bowl. I mean, I watched that game too, and Ole Miss scores a touchdown. They're 1 point away from tying it up, and then I think it was it Jerrion Ely? I think the receiver, dog crawled or whatever into the end zone, and then proceeded to piss like a dog. I mean, he didn't actually, but did the motion and got flagged for it. They missed the extra point, so it became known as the piss and miss. But I think this tops it because Florida literally threw away a college football playoff opportunity. I'm not going to say it was a college football playoff berth because if they play in the ACC Championship game as a one-loss team and lose to Alabama, they're not getting in. Okay, a 2-loss non-conference champions is not getting into the playoff. They're not getting in. So they threw away the opportunity to play for a college football playoff spot. That opportunity, I think, is gone now. I know the committee's kept them at 7, and I think that's to somehow you could twist reality and come up with this idea that if Florida does beat Alabama, even though they're 2-loss, they should get a spot because they didn't drop very far, right? They only dropped one spot. They dropped to 7th. If the committee was serious about this, they would drop them out of the top 10. They have no business being in the top 10. I think the only reason that they are is for 2 reasons. One is if the more likely, there's 2 reasons that they're in the top 10. The first reason, which is the more likely reason, is it makes Alabama's resume look better. Now, I don't think you need Alabama's resume to look better because Alabama has clearly already been picked as the number 1 team. Nothing that any other team can do is going to change that, right? I mean, all it took for Clemson, like last season, was to get a close game against UNC. They dropped. Alabama moved up. That would never happen if it was the reverse. Okay, if Alabama has a close game, it's the depth of the SEC. Clemson's not jumping Alabama if Alabama's still undefeated, and that happened to Clemson. Now this season, right, Clemson lost to Notre Dame, so that makes more sense. However, we all know that if this was reverse, and if Notre Dame had beaten Alabama, Notre Dame would be number 1. Notre Dame beats Clemson, and they're number 2 behind Alabama. So you see how this works. You see how this crap works. Either way, that's the first reason that Florida would stay in the top 10 to help Alabama's resume. The second reason, which is far less likely, is that if Florida were to win the SEC Championship game, let's just play this hypothetical out. Let's say Florida wins the SEC Championship game. Okay, they're 9-2. Being at 7, and only having Iowa State and Texas A&M really in their way, I think you could see some sort of weird movement of Florida up. Now, that's all contingent, I think, on Clemson losing to Notre Dame. Okay, so Clemson doesn't beat Notre Dame. So Alabama has to lose. First, number one that has to happen is Alabama has to lose to Florida. Clemson has to lose to Notre Dame, which in that case, Notre Dame becomes the new number one team. So Notre Dame's at 1. Now Clemson's lost, so they're going to drop out. They're a 2-loss non-conference champion. Goodbye. Oh, let's say Ohio State wins. Okay, they would be probably number 2. So you got Notre Dame 1. You would have Ohio State 2. Alabama probably stays at 3, even though they would have lost to Florida. I think they wouldn't have it in their hearts to put Alabama at 4. So I think Alabama stays at 3. It'll be their first loss of the season. And then I honestly think they would try and put Florida in there at 4. They would try and put Florida in there at 4 as a 2-loss team. And they would give you 2 SEC teams in the top 4, which actually would give you an option to have Alabama and Florida rematch if Florida beats Notre Dame and Alabama beats Ohio State. Texas A&M, again, they're a placeholder at 5. They're not going anywhere. They have hit their ceiling. Congratulations on the Aggies. You had a great year. You had a better year than I was anticipating, but you lost to Alabama, so you don't have an opportunity to play for a conference championship, and you've hit your ceiling. You're done. You're better luck next year. Better luck next year. Great year. You're 7-1. Better luck next year. Iowa State, same thing, right? You know, they're 8-2. They've had kind of an up and down year, but that they've hit their ceiling. They're not gonna crack into the top 4. It's not happening. And so I think in that situation, if Alabama loses, if Clemson loses, if Ohio State wins, Florida could somehow sneak into the top 4. That's a lot that would have to happen for the Gators to get into the top 4. And I think Notre Dame would annihilate them. But that's the only explanation that I could come up with for why on earth you would keep Florida in the top 10 and only move them down 1 spot after losing to an LSU team that has not beaten anyone this year. Like South Carolina, Vanderbilt, and Arkansas. I mean, Cincinnati, Coastal, BYU, even Louisiana Lafayette would demolish those teams. Demolish those teams. I'm just trying to pick teams that are non-Power 5, right? The teams that don't get a lot of credit. Speaking of teams that don't get a lot of credit, Coastal Carolina sitting at 12th, only moving up 1 spot at 11-0 is just absolutely asinine. The fact that there is a 2-loss Oklahoma, a 2-loss Georgia above Coastal Carolina is just insane. I just don't understand that at all. But committee has been consistent in their bias towards Power 5. The bias towards Power 5 is just nauseating this season because I said this from the beginning, this is the year. This is the year an independent gets in. Now, the independent might be Notre Dame, quote unquote, because they're technically ACC this year. But this was the year to have that happen. And I am just shocked that the highest non-Power 5 team is Cincinnati at 8-0. And they actually dropped a spot this week. They dropped 1 spot from 8th to 9th. So it's just hard to comprehend. There's it's 2 teams that are non-Power 5 in the top 15. You got Cincinnati at 9 and Coastal Carolina at 12. In terms of the actual matchup in the ACC Championship game, I was going to pick Alabama before the LSU-Florida game, and I'm going to pick Alabama after the LSU-Florida game. Doesn't change my pick at all. Doesn't change my thoughts at all. Alabama right now playing like the best team in the country. They had a lot of issues on defense. But they've cleaned it up. Florida, maybe they get over this hangover. Maybe they get over this weird, wild loss to LSU. I feel like they probably feel the same way that Penn State did after losing to Indiana. But Indiana actually ended up being a really good team. LSU just sucks. LSU sucks this year. Indiana was actually pretty good. They're only a one-loss team, right? They lost to Ohio State. I think they're right now at they at 8th. No, they're 11th. I'm sorry. They're 8th. They're 11th in the college football playoff rankings. So yeah, this game I think will be all Alabama. I expect Bama to win by at least 3 scores. Right now they're favored by 17. So, I'm not thinking this is going to be a very close matchup. And as we've kind of gone through the different scenarios, right, Alabama needs to lose for Florida to even have a shot, and then Clemson needs to lose, and then Ohio State needs to win. Like, all this other stuff has to happen for Florida. It's just not, Gators lost their opportunity by losing to LSU. But either way, this game shouldn't be very close, and I think Alabama will coast into a college football playoff spot at number 1. It really irritates me to see Florida at 7 after losing a game, because there's no other conference that could get that kind of preferential treatment. I mean, that is just nauseating, really. I mean, I just don't understand that at all. But either way, that's what we're dealing with. So this SEC Championship game, like I said, shouldn't be very close, but I guess we'll see. All right, one last break. Come back, we'll talk briefly about Virginia Tech ending the nation's longest bowl streak. Actually, Coastal Carolina's head coach got a contract extension, and then hey, it's National Signing Day today. All that is next. Welcome back to the show. Last segment of this ugly Christmas sweater after further review. Again, I got my Baby Yoda ugly Christmas sweater on. Hey, let's talk about Virginia Tech here. They announced, I believe earlier today that the team would opt out of the bowl season this year, and that will end the nation's longest bowl streak at 27 years. 27 straight years that Virginia Tech has played in a bowl game, and this was obviously announced by Justin Fuente, the head coach of Virginia Tech. Said he met with the team, and the players collectively decided to bypass on a bowl game this season. Didn't really elaborate much beyond that. I mean, the Virginia Tech Hokies finished 5-6 this season. And in the ACC, you've got Boston College, Pitt, Virginia, and Georgia Tech, in addition to Virginia Tech, that have opted out of a bowl this season. Fuente did say, this is a direct quote there, that there were players who wanted to play, but at the end of the day, the group decision was that they were not going to allow kids to go home for Christmas, and having sacrificed a lot already this season with everything that's happened. And Virginia Tech has really been hit hard by COVID-19 positive cases. They've estimated that about 3/4 of the team has contracted the virus, and 8 of 10 full-time assistants to the team. So it's really been tough for the Hokies. But it's kind of crazy to think about a 27-year bowl streak coming to an end. But hey, in a typical year, if you don't finish 500, right, you're not going to get a bowl invitation typically. So I can't say that I'm super surprised by this, but it certainly is noteworthy, because that's quite an impressive streak that's going to come to an end. And then Jamie Chadwell, Coastal Carolina's head coach, he got a contract extension that'll go through 2027. He was a candidate for a lot of Power 5 coaching jobs, Chadwell was, but obviously has done a lot of great things at Coastal Carolina. He's got them to an 11-0 record this season, first 10-0 team, and I think they're in the Sun Belt, first 10-0 team in Sun Belt history. They're 12th right now in the college football playoff rankings, and he seems to be happy there. He said that he loves the university and the community, and he's excited to be around for a few more years. I don't think the school, it says the school has not released financial details, but it's rumored that this contract is probably the highest paying in the Sun Belt. He was making $375,000 this season as he led them to wins over 2 top 25 opponents this year. So briefly, Chadwell was interviewed for the head coaching vacancy at South Carolina. Obviously, that ended up going to Shane Beamer, Frank Beamer's son. Apparently, the Beamers have a lot of ties to the University of South Carolina. I was not aware of that prior to his hiring. But, another school that he was rumored to be in the hunt for was Virginia Tech if Justin Fuente was dismissed. Now, that obviously has not happened. But, this is a guy that is certainly on the up and up. And he's only in his second season at Coastal Carolina, and he's already got a contract extension through 2027. So, I think, Chanticleers, if they can recruit and they can continue to develop talent, might be a pretty good team in the group of five for a few years. We'll have to see, though, how long Chadwell sticks around. I think that's the big thing, is that there's obviously limitations to Coastal Carolina, as we've seen, right? The committee's not willing to put them in the top 10. For whatever reason, the committee will not put these guys in the top 10 because they play in the Sun Belt, even though they've beaten 2 top 25 teams this year. And eventually Chadwell may want to become, right now he's a big fish in a small pond. He's a big fish in a small pond, and eventually he may want to get out there to the ocean and swim with the sharks. So we'll see how long he stays. He's 43 years old right now, but hey, pretty comfortable to get a contract extension in your second year coaching. And then National Signing Day is today. No big news that I have seen. I mean, obviously Alabama has the top recruiting class this season. And to be honest with you, a signing day for me is something that, I don't, it's not that I dislike it, right? It's not that I dislike signing day. I just think it's blown up way out of proportion. I don't think, we need to have press conferences and all this other stuff for a kid deciding where he's going to go play ball. I just think it's a little bit too commercialized for me. I understand why some people think it's a really big deal, and obviously recruiting is, how college football programs become great. Recruiting is that secret weapon, and when you have coaches that are able to recruit well, it can totally turn around a program. Now, Lane Kiffin at Ole Miss, I think, is a really good example of this. Actually, I'm looking at a tweet that he posted earlier today. It's a shirt that says Merry Flipmas, and the A has been converted into the state of Mississippi. Just talking about, guys flipping schools and ending up in Oxford. But I saw too that they actually, Ole Miss flipped MJ Daniels from Mississippi State, who was a ESPN 300 cornerback. But honestly, I think that it shouldn't be quite as commercialized as it is. But again, it's a big deal, and obviously, it has a huge impact on what programs look like, for years to come. I think is the biggest thing. But you also have schools out there like Tennessee, or USC even, that they always get good recruits, or Michigan, right? They always get good recruits, but there's no talent development there. Alabama, Clemson's known for taking guys that are passed by a lot of schools and then developing them into really, really good football players. But yeah, I mean, you got the top 5 classes right now are Alabama, Ohio State at 2, Georgia is at 3, LSU is 4th, Clemson has a top 5 recruiting class. This is Clemson's 7th straight top 10. Oregon has the 6th best recruiting class, Florida at 7, Notre Dame 8, North Carolina at 9. Now this is interesting. The Tar Heels had a 16th ranked class in 2020, but 2021 that they have cracked the top 10. And that is an indication that right there should show everyone Mac Brown is an expert recruiter. This man can recruit with anybody in the country, because we all remember several years ago what a laughingstock UNC was. And, the Larry Fedora years and everything, Mac Brown has really turned this program's image around, and he's pulling in some serious recruits, and the Tar Heels are in the top 10. You've got to feel good if you're a North Carolina fan, because you're in there with the cream of the crop, right? The Miamis. Miami comes here in at 10. You end up with the Miamis, the Clemsons, and even the schools in the other conferences like Florida or Oregon or Ohio State. That's a big deal for the Tar Heels. So something to certainly watch. But then you got your typical teams like Tennessee at 11, Oklahoma at 12, USC at 13, Michigan at 14, Texas at 15. Again, bunch of schools that get great recruits every year, and then they just fizzle out, and they just don't develop them into the star players that they really have the potential to be. And that's really more of a coaching problem than the players aren't as good as we actually thought they were. Like the talent is there. The talent is there, but the coaching and the talent development is not. Interesting, though, other teams in the top 20 that I thought were noteworthy is Cal. Cal comes in at 18th. They have a lot of offensive players this year that put them in the top 25. Maryland comes in at 19th. Arkansas is 20th. There's some interesting teams here that I would not have expected to see in the top 20. And Florida State actually rounds out the top 25. They have the 25th best recruiting class this season. We'll see what Mike Norvell does. We'll see what Mike Norvell does. I'm interested to see how Florida State looks in 3 or 4 years. Right now, it's rough, but in 3 or 4 years, I'm really interested to see what the Seminoles look like and how well Mike Norvell turns that program around, because he did a good job at Memphis, but Florida State's a whole nother ball game, and you're competing in a conference now that has the most consistent college football program for the last 7 or 8 years in Clemson. And so you've got to you've really got to be, especially when you're in the same division as them. It's kind of like you're in Auburn, right? Clemson is that. Alabama and Clemson are running that division, and then Auburn and Florida State typically, they're trying to upset and dethrone the king. Now in the past it was reversed for Florida State and Clemson. But as of right now, the Tigers hold the edge. So something certainly to keep an eye on. But either way, that's been it for this edition of After Further Review. Absolutely tune in to the ACC Championship game this weekend between Clemson and Notre Dame. It figures to be probably one of the best conference championships any of us have ever watched. I mean, I really think it'll be an instant classic like the first one that we saw. It's going to have enormous implications for the college football playoff. So enjoy your Saturday, and we'll see you back here next week. I'm Jay Smith, and this has been After Further Review.